are live with another Africa Oil Empower and Africa Energy Chamber webinar. We are very excited about today's webinar. We are looking at examining the question, is now the time for renewables, looking at some impacts of COVID-19, and also getting into some issues of competitiveness, technology. I am thrilled for this conversation today. Before I introduce Dr. Clinton Carter-Brown and before we get into the conversation, I just want to highlight some housekeeping items. If everybody can look kind of at the bottom panel of your Zoom screen, you'll see a chat box. This chat box is for engaging with each other. Please, feel free to talk about your ideas and some comments on what the panelists are saying. You'll also see a Q&A box. Please put your questions for the panelists in the Q&A box. That way we can bring some audience engagement to this webinar and get some of your questions to the panelists as we go throughout the conversation. In the chat box, we're also going to be adding a link from Susie, the Senior Advisor of Policy and Communications for the Office of Nuclear Energy of the U.S. Department of Energy. Just a little bit of information about advanced reactor technology, a fact sheet, just for your information, because that's some pretty heavy technology that she's going to be talking about today. The format for this webinar, we're going to have a discussion with our panelists, followed by a brief question and answer session with the media. If you're a member of the media and you want to ask a question to our esteemed panelists, can you please, again, just type in that chat box, and one of my colleagues who is monitoring that will get back to you about a slot for you at the end of the conversation to ask some questions of our panelists. And with that, I'm going to hand the conversation over to Dr. Clinton Carter-Brown, who is the head of the Energy Center for the South African Council for Scientific and Industrial Research, to start today's webinar. Dr. Carter-Brown, you're on mute.
Yes, super. Thank you, Katie. And good afternoon, good morning, good evening, colleagues. Wonderful to be here, and thank you for the opportunity. I'll be moderating today's panel, and we'll start off with some introductions in terms of our panelists. And firstly, thank you to them for making themselves available for today's webinar. So first, we'll start with Susie Jaworowski. She's with the U.S. Department of Energy in the Office of Nuclear Energy. In that role, she's a senior advisor and serves as a political liaison between the Office of Nuclear Energy and the Secretary of Energy, as well as the White House, where she provides political and strategic leadership to the office and manages various outreach and educational efforts in the area of civil nuclear energy. Secretary Perry asked Suzanne, Susie, with his initiative to make cool nuclear again through a communications and education program around modern technology. It's really great to have Susie here. She is also chairman of the International Framework for Nuclear Energy Cooperation, which is a 65-country government-to-government organization dedicated to safety, security, and peaceful use of nuclear energy. So she's operating at that international level, and it will be really great to bring in those perspectives, and specifically around the new developments around advanced, scalable, modular nuclear reactors, and the potential role that can play in Africa. Great to have you here, Susie. Next panelist that I'd like to introduce is Massaer Cisse. He is the general manager of Lekela Power in Senegal, which is on the west coast of Africa, top north, in fact on the westmost tip of Africa. And there he is the general manager of Lekela Power, where he's responsible for overseeing their investment projects through to financial close, construction and long-term operation. So he is very involved in the development of and creation of new projects and seeing them actually implemented in the region. He also focuses on social investment programs with local communities and developing those projects, which is really important. And prior to joining Lekela, he was the director of Deloitte, where he's led multidisciplinary teams assisting multinationals around various sectors and international investment projects. So really great to have you here. Then our final panelist is certainly well known to me. Worked with her in my days as well. Nelly Magubane. She is the chairman of Matleng Energy Solutions here in South Africa. She started at Eskom, which is the South African major electricity utility, and after a stint with private sector consulting, she joined the Department of Mineral Energy, where she essentially moved through the ranks, and in December 2009 was actually appointed as the Director General of the Department of Energy in the Republic of South Africa, where she was responsible for a range of things, the development of the South African Integrated Resource Plan, generation plan for the country, as well as improving access to over 1 million households to energy in a 4-year period. She's got a broad range of expertise, and in her more recent involvements through Matleng Energy, is involved in a number of energy projects in the region, for example, in Tanzania and Senegal at present. So good afternoon to our panelists, and thank you for the opportunity to be your moderator. We've got a range of questions that we'll pose, and of course through the process, the Q&A, we can also, time permitting, we would be great to engage on some of the questions on the floor. And our first set of questions is really around the impact of COVID-19 very specifically on the local energy landscape. Africa has abundant both fossil fuels and renewable resources. There are many economies that have been dependent, for example, on natural gas or oil exports in terms of fueling revenues, and of course, with the impacts of COVID and the drying up of those markets, that has resulted in certainly a lot of price tension and lower pricing, specifically in the oil market and natural gas market. That is both a challenge to African countries in terms of the impact it has on revenues and the ability then to finance various projects and infrastructure. On the other hand, low-cost natural gas, for example, is a real opportunity for the region in terms of being able to drive economic growth on the back of lower-cost energy supply options. But that then comes at a premium, especially if they're fossil fuel-based. So part of our deliberation today is the extent to which the change in the market dynamics is in fact going to be a driver, or perhaps possibly even an inhibitor or delayer of renewable energy adoption on the continent, given that traditional fossil fuel-based options may appear to be more attractive or cost-effective in the media. So with that, we'll hand over to each of our three panelists for their introductory remarks in terms of that context. And perhaps we'll start with Susie. Thank you.
Yes, Dr. Carter-Brown, thank you. Hello to all of our participants and those around the world. It's after 9 a.m. here on the East Coast of the United States. I know it's around 3 o'clock in the afternoon in South Africa. Wherever time it is, wherever you are, welcome and thank you for joining. I'm very honored to be part of this esteemed panel. So Katie and Dr. Carter-Brown, thank you for inviting me. I think on this topic of a post-COVID world and what we've just experienced in an unprecedented global pandemic, it brings forth two really important issues when thinking about energy sourcing and planning and the market volatility, which we know is part of many different fuel sourcing for electricity, and emphasized in what we've seen in the gas and oil markets in the last few months. And then also the issue of reliability and baseload resources. Here in the United States, our strategy is really to employ an all of the above strategy. We have a very diverse landscape, and state by state, they make their decisions about what energy sources are right in their state. And our profile to move forward with the resources we have as cleanly and efficiently as we can. I work in the Office of Nuclear Energy, and we work very closely with renewables on clean energy systems all over the globe. And we feel that it's important to consider both those aspects that have been heightened in the COVID world, where market volatility and also the secure delivery of energy resources being essential. So I hope to be able to talk to you a little bit about how nuclear can play a role in a clean energy source, that it has the ability with advanced nuclear, especially to load follow and works very nicely with the renewable. And so I would like to elaborate a little bit more in our conversation as we move forward. But yes, I think COVID has brought out those two, especially on market volatility and the essential reliability issues.
Sorry, you're on mute again.
Thank you, Katie. I think I'll just leave it unmuted. Thank you. Massaer, maybe over to you then in terms of your thoughts around that local energy landscape and the impacts.
Sure. First of all, thank you to the Africa Energy Chamber for organizing such a, and AOP for organizing such an important webinar, in my opinion. Thanks, Kathy, for putting it together, and thanks, Dr. Clinton, for leading the charge on this. As you said in your introductions, the topics you raised are very, very up to date. They're even more important today. And anything around renewable energy and green energy transition, especially in a world living in or starting to move to a post, hopefully soon, COVID pandemic situation, those questions will be front and center of any discussion around energy, especially for Africa. So I think, my main topics will be around the long-term trend of the renewable energy in our global energy mix. Of course, what has been the impact, and it's a little bit early to really say, but what's the impact that is going to be expected in the near future, in the near term, for the development of renewable energy? How can our local and national leaderships can really help develop renewable energies, both from an ideological perspective, because of the more present and more urgent ecological need of it, and also from a pure business perspective. As you all know, renewable energy in the past 20 years has been on a really upward slope. So it's been developing very strongly. Now it's even very competitive when it comes to pricing. And in most of the country, if not the vast majority, it's competing without a subsidy. And just to give you a quick number, if you look at the new power generation capacity installed worldwide, renewable energy represented 72% of new energy power capacity installed in the world. That's a huge number. For 2020, the World Energy Global Renewable Energy Agency expects renewable energy to still grow despite COVID. There's no other source of energy that can say the same thing. So I think we have a pretty strong panel put together. So I will pass the mic on, but I will be glad to take on more of those topics going forward.
Thank you, Massaer. And Nelly, your thoughts, please.
Thank you very much, Clinton, and also like to thank AOP for arranging this webinar, which I think is quite opportune and also very, very important for the African continent. The way I see COVID-19 in the clean energy transition, I must say, on the positive side, we've seen less commuting. Therefore, we've seen cleaner air in most of the countries because there is less mobility. So on that note, I think that has been quite positive. But when it comes to the issues around the negative side of it, we've seen a significant reduction in the demand of energy due to depressed economic activity. But more so, we've also seen a situation where we're going to be seeing more nationalistic agendas because of people wanting to protect whatever that is in their countries and trying to revive their local economies. And that is going to create a situation where more indigenous resources being utilized. And amongst others, I'm talking now about fossil fuels. So we are going to see a lot of that taking place because of countries looking at that. So we are going to be seeing quite a lot of a supply chain constraints that is going to making mobility again of goods and services, especially in terms of energy infrastructure. So that is what we are seeing at COVID-19. However, it gives an opportunity for long-term planning where we are going to be seeing a lot of economies beginning to rise and also therefore requiring more energy resources. Of course, it's not going to be overnight, but we are going to be seeing quite a lot of that growth going into the future. And the renewable energy is going to play a very, very crucial role in that future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nelly. Thank you, panelists. So it's a very broad, diverse suite of challenges and the context. I think if we also reflect on some of the maybe green deals or the other arrangements that certainly some of the developing economies are looking to perhaps position some of their economic recovery post-COVID. I've seen some very interesting developments, for example, in Germany, looking at using COVID stimulus packages to really start to drive things like accelerating green hydrogen, economic recovery, just green or circular economy investments in general, and using the post-COVID landscape to try and accelerate some of that technology development and its implementation. Now, many African countries are perhaps not as fortunate in terms of having that fiscal space to be able to make kinds of deep investments, and to some extent are perhaps technology takers. So that does then implement or create a very immediate or near-term challenge, especially where supply chains may be constrained. And we know that renewable energy technologies, in fact, many technologies that are deployed in Africa, are not necessarily manufactured at scale in Africa. And there will be, understandably, from a sort of, perhaps it's not protectionism, but just simple reality of looking to want to implement energy mix options that are not dependent on manufacturing in other parts of the globe, that are so dramatically impacted with things such as what we've experienced with COVID. So it's perhaps quite complex in terms of the challenges around technology costs and the cost of fossil fuels such as gas and oil in the immediate, the availability or the access to the markets to manufacture them, and then the long-term plans around localizing those technologies in Africa. But maybe let's start then with what is the present long-term view around the energy mix, for example, in Africa, and maybe with Senegal or with yourself, Massaer. I'll start with you. Where do you see that long-term energy mix going, regardless of COVID?
Sure, and thanks again, Clinton. So when it comes to the long-term trend, and I think that's really what we have to focus on. COVID, of course, is a pandemic. By definition, it's a shock. It's an external shock. So it's really impacting the entire world and the entire economy pretty much the same way. So that means that the underlying trends that were true before COVID for renewable energy in relations to fossil fuel sources of energy are still true today. And they will be true after COVID. So the impact of COVID, in my opinion, is felt across the board. However, there's something that renewable energy, I think, has going for itself, is that it's a renewable energy in the sense that the sources of that energy doesn't need to be conveyed to a physical plant. For example, I'm taking the case of Lekela's power plant in Senegal, wind power plant in Senegal, represent 15% of the country's power capacity. That's pretty big. Can you imagine that plant was running on heavy fuel, and because of COVID-19, the fuel supply chain has been disrupted in major ways? Maybe it would have a negative impact on the power supply of Senegal. So renewable has many facets a lot of people don't realize that are very positive, especially for cash and forex strapped countries in Africa like ours. That's very important. The impact on a renewable energy plant on a country's balance of payment is huge. And this is for oil importing countries. Now, if you move away from the economic, like I said earlier, renewable energy are now very competitive. You know, they are being put in places without subsidies, and that's true in pretty much the entire globe. So if you look at it from a non-economic perspective, from an ecological perspective, again, what was true before COVID is still true now and might even be more true after COVID. A lot of people in the world are making a link. Of course, not a direct link or a causal link, but there is some people out there, scientifically minded people, some others less scientifically minded, who are claiming that we have been living beyond our natural boundaries. That has an impact on the global ecological system, whether we like it or not. And a good amount of that impact is derived from fossil sources of energy. And this has been going for decades, if not centuries. So in the context of Africa, of course, if you look at that whole time frame, we are not responsible for that global warming or the current global warming level, or our impact on it has been, you know, relatively speaking, pretty small. But guess what? We are the first victim of that, because our economies are not strong enough to sustain the impact of climate change, whether it's droughts, whether it's floods. Those are direct impact of a climate change system to which, of course, we are not responsible, but we are a victim of. So we do have a responsibility from and this is a purely African perspective. We have a responsibility beyond the economic, consideration about, and of course, the technological consideration about renewable being competitive or not. We have an ecological responsibility to contribute to finding solutions of those. So I think the long-term trend of renewable energy is pretty bright, despite COVID. And some studies do point out to a stronger pickup for renewable energy post-COVID.
It's really interesting.
I couldn't agree with more. You made many excellent points, and I'd like to follow on to especially the point about the long-term strategy will be the same post-COVID, because what's important in your state, in your local region, should be driving how you make your energy choices. And it's true that we all have to be responsible, and in taking into consideration the output and the impacts that Africa experiences, each country will, of course, make decisions based on economics, localization, workforce, and the clean energy strategy that's going to work and be effective in their part of the world. In the United States, nuclear energy provides 1% of our electricity here in the US, but it is 60% of the carbon-free electricity that we develop here in the United States. Nuclear provides about 10% of the global electricity. And so around the world, countries are making their decisions about what works well for them. And so speaking from my IFNEC point of view, and IFNEC, for those who aren't familiar, IFNIC is the International Framework for Nuclear Energy Cooperation, IFNEC. And it's a 65-country government-to-government organization that shares cooperatively technology and networking all about nuclear power. And so it's a good place to learn about what's happening in nuclear around the world as a very friendly networking place. But what's important about that is those intergovernmental agreements. So when an African nation decides on their clean energy system and how they might build it, whatever intergovernmental agreements go into place there with their government-to-government partners, I think that's the time where you really think about things like the economics of this, the localization, the workforce, how much of your local folks will be employed at that power plant, if it can be partnered, for example, with a manufacturing program and be used as a infrastructure tool to drive further economic development. One example I can think of there is on many of the advanced reactor technologies, small modular reactors and micros, it's a very versatile product producing electricity where it can load follow, work really well with renewables, wind, solar, hydro, but it also can provide desalination or hydrogen production that can be byproducts and also additional producers for that power plant. So I think backing up and looking at the big picture of planning for your clean energy system and how all the different parts and pieces can fit together, and how important it is that if you are going to choose to work with another government and working as a partner, establishing those opportunities that are right for your nation up front and what's going to best employ your people is a critical element in planning those future energy systems and programs.
Thank you, Susie. And I guess and maybe we'll also come back to some of the new next generation nuclear reactor, design, and certainly nuclear in Africa has always been a massive challenge in terms of the size of our power systems and the ability to integrate nuclear plants and the traditional sort of large gigawatt scale plants, certainly African context from a system reliability and system reserves perspective has always been a huge constraint to nuclear energy, as well as the financing. So I'd love to come back to that. Nelly, from a sort of on the southern side of Africa and
yeah.
in the region, what are the long-term energy mixes been indicating in the last 2-3 years in terms of the renewable energy trend? And perhaps what extent do you see any fundamental shifts based on what we've been experiencing in COVID? Or do you think that trajectory is going to remain largely unaffected?
No, absolutely. Thank you very much for the question. Just to indicate that Africa is well endowed with renewable energy resources, and already renewable energy has become very, very competitive compared to other fuel sources. But of course, that depends entirely on the demand curve of the country. If I can just give you a practical example, in South Africa, the peak demand and the peak generation from our solar energy resources, there is a big mismatch there. So that simply means then, therefore, that you need to support renewable energy. We need to have a pragmatic approach that says that our energy mix must be such that we are able to balance the resources, but your biggest outcome should be a lower carbon footprint. So whatever energy mix that you decide upon as a country, it must be such that the carbon footprint must be lowered, not necessarily simply just saying one energy source is better than the other, but it's a question of how do we make sure that all these energy sources, they support each other. Let me just give you a very, very practical example. In Ghana, as we speak right now, they are seeing quite an increase, or rather a boom in their mining industry, specifically in the gold sector. Those are 24-hour operations. So therefore, you're definitely going to need energy that is going to support those kind of operations. So therefore, you need to have a balanced energy mix to be able to do that. So that's one important issue that we need to deal with. But also a number of countries that are endowed with fossil fuels are actually having a little bit of a challenge at the moment, where very little investment is taking place in the fossil fuels infrastructure. And this, again, it creates a challenge of forex for these particular countries. So we need to be able to say, how do we make sure that we minimize, or rather we reduce carbon emissions, and making sure then that we still are able, those countries are able to be supported, also to be able to deploy renewable energy going into the future. And also, amongst other things that are very, very important in the mining space is the issue of the battery energy storage. When it comes to the battery energy storage, a lot of these minerals are obtained in Africa. And that simply means then, therefore, that Africa is going to need some certain level of energy intensity that will support those mining operations in order for us to be able to have these battery energy storages to support in return renewable energy sources. So effectively, we need to adopt a pragmatic approach that says that here are the resources, be it nuclear energy, be it gas, or be it renewable energy. How do we deploy to benefit the country in the most possible way? And the issue around climate change. Climate change for Africa is a reality. We actually, especially in the southern tip of Africa, we have actually seen the countries that are generating their energy from hydro experiencing very, very, very low energy generation because of the drought. So therefore, these are clean energy sources that we can utilize, but we need therefore to be able to say, how do we support them when such situations happen? So for me, renewable energy is the future. Renewable energy has become very, very cost competitive, but how do we make sure then that it meets our energy demand as a continent? Thank you.
Perfect. And I'm just going to jump in quickly because we're getting some questions from the audience that I'd like to start bringing up. So just kind of sticking with this energy mix concept for a minute, we're getting a lot of questions actually, so I'm going to merge a couple questions into one. And we also just ran a poll. What do you see being the most prominent fuel source in the coming years? 47% of people said renewables, and 51% of you said hydrocarbons, only 2% said coal, so that's a bit interesting. But looking at this idea of a just transition, Aili Shihama, sorry if I said that incorrectly, wants to know if a just transition should take into account oil and gas producing countries and where that leaves them in terms of their economic development and where they can go in the future. And kind of on that note, Colin Graham asked if natural gas is the best baseload fuel to partner with renewables and the best opportunity for intra-African trade. So Nelly, you might be the best suited to kind of talk about that one, but she just stopped away. Dr. Carter Brown, do you want to
Yeah, maybe I can also give some perspective. So and within our energy sector here in South Africa, in our council, we're doing a lot of deep modeling of the future energy mix, as well as the implications in terms of, for example, the just transition. It really is at the center of many of the decisions that need to be made. And just for the context of everyone on this webinar, more than 90% of South Africa's electricity is coal-based. So it's an extremely carbon-intensive electricity system. Probably, in fact, the most carbon-intensive, one of the most carbon-intensive globally. We also turn coal into liquid fuels for our local transportation. So by and large, we've got some of the highest CO2 emissions per GDP and per capita in the globe. And we've built whole economies based on coal. We have whole regions of our country, towns and districts that are based on coal mining. And one can then appreciate the shift from coal to renewables is going to have deep socio-economic implications. And so we need to have a very deliberate plan to make such a transition to renewable energy. And we've done a lot of the modeling around what that might look like. It's very, very clear that the cheapest, most sustainable energy, given our wind and resources and hydro, is renewable electricity. And that over time we will gradually transition. It's not going to be overnight, a decade or two or three to make that transition. And things such as oil and gas will be transitionary fuels, and natural gas specifically will have a huge role to play in the foreseeable use to complement the variability of renewable energy. And there's then also a carrier in terms of into hydrogen. You know, we need to build out the natural gas networks in Africa, and then gradually over time then leverage very, very cheap renewable energy to then generate clean hydrogen that can then displace natural gas. So there's a massive opportunity that comes with creating new jobs and new economies. And the modeling that we've done in that regard is that even if a fairly substantial portion of the renewable energy value chain is still imported into Africa, we will create more jobs, more local jobs through a renewable energy transition. Appreciating that we still have, more than 1 billion people that do not have access to clean or even dirty energy on the continent. So there's a massive backlog in energy access, which can be done on the basis of renewable energy and create new jobs. So the issue of a just transition is central, but it can be managed. That would be my sort of views based on the modeling that we've been doing, and specifically for South Africa, but I think it scales into the region. And I'd like to hear what the other sort of panelists' views are around that, and then also in terms of that, Susie, around the role of nuclear in terms of a just transition. Because certainly the modeling that we've done is that the traditional nuclear technology does not enter a least cost energy mix in South Africa. Based on present pricing. What are your thoughts there?
Thank you, Dr. Brown. Yes, I'd like to address a couple of the questions and also just make note that the poll did not offer a specific option for nuclear. I don't know if nuclear is kind of lumped into the renewable or carbon-free power subject, but that's just one note I saw in the comments. And the question was about, is gas the best base load source to work with renewables? If you're really working towards a clean energy system, a low carbon output, I would say, looking at your particular area, as Nelly mentioned, Africa is well blessed with lots of natural resources for renewables. And so, of course, that's a great place for African energy systems to come from. If you're looking for a base load to support that, I would just submit, don't count out nuclear. Think about nuclear as an option, because with advanced nuclear, especially some of the small modular reactors, the micro reactors, and even some of the full-size advanced reactors are much more economically competitive. Many of the small modular reactor designs that are coming online in the next 3 to 5 years will be very comparable to a combined cycle natural gas plant. So if you're thinking about gas or a base load as gas is a great option for certain places. If that works for you, terrific. But if you're looking at something as a base load, don't count out nuclear, because the new nuclear are competitive with the combined cycle gas plants for capital costs. And they're about 25% of what the capital costs are for traditional nuclear. So that's one point, that advanced nuclear is much more cost competitive than it has been in the past. And then I noticed in the comments, there was a question from Elizabeth, and Elizabeth asked about, with so many countries turning away from nuclear, what's the point of view to consider nuclear? And I think that you look at the countries that are turning away from nuclear, and most of them are increasing their CO2 output, and their emissions are increasing. And so some of their goals can be at odds, whether they're looking at enhancing the safety of their programs versus lowering carbon emissions. And I just want to make the point again, when looking at advanced nuclear, some of the features that are part of advanced nuclear, walk away safe is a feature, so that essentially these new plants are meltdown proof. In the event of a high heat situation that could turn into an issue, these plants are able to shut down on their own. They don't require a second source, a backup energy source to do that, and can do it without human intervention. So meltdown proof nuclear power is coming, and that solves a lot of issues that have been with some legacy nuclear in the past. So again, my theme is always going to be, think about what's best for your country, and if you think gas is your best base load, then that's terrific, but don't count out at least considering nuclear, because new nuclear is competitive price-wise.
If I can also, so thanks, Clinton, for that input. I cannot add anything more on that. What I just wanted to address was what was questioned by Ian Christie regarding the role of renewable energy in accelerating the deployment of microgrids. And I think renewable energy is going to be quite key into that, because what has been the problem, especially in the continent, it has been the location of the generation of energy to where it's supposed to be consumed or supposed to be utilized. And in the process, you needed long transmission networks in order to be able to achieve that. But with the renewable energy being supported by your battery energy storage facilities, then you can create a whole new energy system for far-flung communities or communities who've never had access to energy before. So that way, then you are able to make sure then that you do not spend as much as you would have on the transportation of electrons. Like, for example, as we speak right now in South Africa, you have at least approximately about 86% access to electricity. But the 14% that is left is not going to be supplied by traditional long transmission line or long distribution line. The solutions there are going to be localized energy systems. So hence, therefore, renewable energy becomes key in that regard.
Thank you, Nelly.
Yeah.
Please.
Sorry, Dr. Clinton, just a quick addition to that point. And what I usually try to, an example I like to use when it comes to transition from a fossil fuel-based energy source to renewable in the African context is the best example is access to telecommunication. African communities went from not having access to telecom and telephone to trading on mobile platforms. That is the best example of transition that renewable energy will bring to the energy context in Africa. A lot of villages didn't have access to energy because of what Nelly just mentioned, lack of transmission lines. They're very expensive to put in place. And when you get to the last mile, maybe the demand locally, which is mostly domestic based, is not high enough to justify the investment. That was true for telecommunication. But when mobile technology came online, the whole dynamics changed. All of a sudden, we are not talking about a transition, we're not talking about an evolution, it became a revolution. The same situation is happening in the energy sector. And again, the main driver of the transformation and the revolution is technological. We are making leaps and bounds in the renewable energy sector, whether it's battery storage solutions, whether it's energy intermittency solutions in terms of data analysis to have better forecasting tools and methods. Those are making leaps and bounds when it comes to progress. And I think in a very few years, we will find again ourselves in the situation where renewables will be a non-brainer for many, many reasons. I think Nelly alluded to to the concept of island networks. in terms of renewable energy. Why do you need to build hundreds of kilometers of transmission line to only supply 50 megawatts of capacity? If that area has enough renewable energy, why don't you use the renewable energy sector, resource to provide the power locally? And I think we are moving into that direction. And in my opinion, also, nuclear has a role to play. Again, this is a technological, fight. It's a technological race. A lot of time we put this concept of economy and ecological, but the main driver is technological. That was true even for coal. The reason South Africa has such a big reliance on coal was just because coal was abundantly available. South Africa wasn't born with just say, oh, we will only do coal. No, the reason why South Africa is dependent on coal was abundantly available. The same thing is true for renewable, and more, the technological advances will make that outcome very plausible in the very near future, I think.
Super. And you've introduced a very important context around this sort of, I think you called it a revolution in terms of what we saw in the mobile telecommunication space that is now starting to play out with renewable energy combined with energy storage and the opportunities that it gives Africa. And I'd like to reflect on the question by Khafi in terms of the extent to which renewable energy, for example, requires subsidies now. Is it actually cheaper to deploy renewable energy at, say, the microgrid scale for rural electrification all the way through to national electricity supply across different geographies in Africa? Appreciating that it's always going to be part of an energy mix. There will be a role for the likes of gas, but the extent to which renewable energy requires subsidies, because we've seen an absolute fundamental shift in South Africa in the last 8 years. And there's absolutely no subsidies required for large-scale renewable energy deployment in South Africa at the moment. I'd appreciate the other panelists' views in terms of the experiences in the US, Susie, and then in the likes of Senegal, that also has a substantial offshore natural gas resource that it can tap into.
Yes, I think we share around the globe with subsidies on all different fuel sources and the economic feasibility of what's right in your specific area. So policy obviously drives those decisions, and it will make a difference based on where you are and how you decide, what the economic, because at the end of the day, as you said, coal has been around for so long because it is abundant and it is low cost. And sometimes, people need electricity, and that is their best way of doing it. And so whether it's coal, natural gas, nuclear, wind, solar, hydro, I think your area and your policy and what makes it sense to you for your goals is going to drive that. And we all share those challenges. Some of the questions that came up that I noticed and I wanted to be able to address before we sign off that were specific to me. One was about the promise of fusion in the future, and a lot of people are interested in that topic. I can say there's a lot of private and public investment going into fusion. It's interesting because in the last 5 to 10 years, the investments in fusion technology have really increased. So I would say that's any indication of that we perhaps could be getting closer to that. That is an interesting point to watch. Also, there was a question about the floating reactor, if there's any kind of a competitor for the floating reactor. And I'd say yes, the US government is working through the Department of Defense with private to develop what we're calling a mobile micro reactor. So it is a small reactor that can be put on a boat or perhaps an airplane and a truck, shipped to wherever you need it, used for the time period that you may need it, and then moved on to another place. It would be designed for mobile use and put in, like, for example, when Puerto Rico had their hurricane and knocked out all the power. If we had that micro mobile reactor, deploy it to the island nation, use a microgrid, and people are back up in a short period of time. So both of those, I think, are realities in the future, especially the mobile reactor that will be available soon. And those are available and things to consider as you're planning your future energy source. Thanks for the questions to our online audience.
Thank you, Susie. And maybe to the rest of my panelists, and in reflecting on the great questions that are coming through, if there are any that any of you would like to respond to, I know there's one specifically there in South Africa, maybe yourself, Nelly, or I can respond to Mozambique and gas, but maybe colleagues, maybe I'll start with you, Nelly. Nelly, you're muted.
Okay, great stuff. Thank you very much. Yes, on the issue around the gas, I firmly believe that our current integrated resource plan sees gas as not as base load, but more as mid-merit, but more than anything else also as a transitional fuel, because the idea is to retire our coal-fired power plants, but at the same time make sure that as part of the just transition, we are able to deploy renewable energy, but more than anything else, start looking at what other economic activities we can start looking at in those areas which are formerly mining producers. Now, when it comes to the issue around Mozambique, Mozambique has been a source of gas for our country for the past at least 20 years. And we still see that process continuing. But also, South Africa has also successfully made some gas finds in its waters, which also can also be utilized again as a transitional fuel going into the future. So for us, that's basically what we are looking at. We're very, very keen in making sure that the exploration that is happening in Mozambique continues to take place, but more than anything else, what is going to be quite important is also to make sure then that Mozambique experience the kind of economic growth that we have seen, because our view is that as our neighbors, they also can be our potential customers.
And thank you, Nelly. And in reflecting further on some of the questions, one of the threads that's coming through is the ability to localize technologies in Africa. And whether it's batteries that are leveraging our local minerals, given cobalt and other that we have in abundance in Africa, through to the manufacturing of renewable energy technologies. Most of it is presently imported. For example, there is some limited solar PV panel assembly on the continent, but the actual panels, the wafers, it's all imported technology. Yet we do have the silicon, we do have the resources. So how does one create a pan-African approach, similar to, I guess, the equivalents of the European Union and others, that can give effect to truly collaborating across African countries, to be able to leverage our combined resources? Because any one country might struggle to have sufficient offtake, for example, to localize panel manufacturing, solar PV panel manufacturing. You probably need a gigawatt a year scale to make that economic. Any one country, that's a challenge. But certainly as a continent or a region, that is very achievable. So I'd appreciate the panelists' views on how we do that, and what are the post-COVID opportunities to do that, as then talk to the just transition. How will we actually start to invest in the localization of those technologies? Because when people start to get jobs as a result of deploying technologies, it will become pervasive very, very quickly. So I'd really appreciate the panelists' views on that. And then, of course, the role of in energy in Africa as part of that opportunity as we transition the energy system.
Yeah, if I can jump in there, Clinton? Okay, my initial views basically are that we are going to need to start talking around the issues of intellectual property rights. So in other words, and also in intellectual property laws. And now I'm talking now globally. I'm not talking just about Africa, because some of the technologies have been developed elsewhere. That's the first issue that I would also say. But also how an organization like yourself, who has done extensive work in the beneficiation of minerals for renewable energy sources and battery storage, how do we share or how do we make sure that we deploy some of that knowledge in some of the countries, and also making sure that we are able also to have a footprint in some of those countries which we know that they are endowed with those mineral resources. So I think it's going to be quite important that we start looking at issues around the IP, but also I think governments have learned the hard way in the past, where everything was just being dug out of the soil and be shipped out of the country, of their respective countries. I think now the governments need to start having certain conditions on those minerals, how they get utilized in the countries where they are actually found.
Thank you, Nelly. And I'm just reflecting on the results of the poll in terms of the extent to which Africa is competitive. And I'm assuming we may find, and it would be very useful if we could get a sense, or we could quickly run a poll, colleagues, how many of our participants are in Africa versus international. Because it's a bit of a sad indictment that the majority of us feel that we are not good with competitively implementing and innovating new technologies in the power sector. And that really, really has to change. And the link to IP is perhaps very important, but how do we make it attractive for the global OEMs, manufacturers and suppliers to establish local manufacturing in Africa for the African market, where they will, specifically choose to establish new factories and industries in Africa? What is it that they need in terms of offtake arrangements that would make Africa an attractive market? And especially in a post-COVID world, where relying on imported equipment is inherently going to trigger, increased risk. So I challenge our panelists, what is it that we need to do as Africans to A, be better at developing these technologies, and B, to be an attractive market where people will want to come and set up manufacturing in Africa? Because we don't necessarily always have to develop the new IP, but if it's manufactured in South Africa and those revenues, or in Africa, and those taxes then flow into the local economies and local people are employed, renewable energy will just become increasingly pervasive. Your thoughts there. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to jump in there if I may, and just going to mix a few of the answers and questions that were sent. They're all very interesting. I think we could spend hours here, talking about them. The first one I want to touch on is with regard to subsidies. Renewable energy is now competitive. Most countries are not subsidizing renewable energy. As an example, Lekela Power, we are a Pan-African renewable energy developer and operator. Actually, we have a few wind farms in South Africa. Senegal is our first in West Africa. We're running a new one in Egypt. So we're across the continent. And across the continent, no subsidies on our project. Not a dime of those governments are being subsidized to our project. The other point is, more and more, because of the technological, again, leaps and bounds, the change in tariffs that we are being able to propose are decreasing drastically and very rapidly. So that's the first point about subsidies. The second point I wanted to touch on is, a lot of time when you are in a crisis mode, or in an African continent context, because of the current, low prices in fossil fuel source of energy, whether it's gas, which has and oil, whose prices have plummeted. Countries tend to say, oh well, this is not, maybe the green transition is unnecessary. That's a huge mistake, because this is a blip. Sooner or later, we will get out of it. We've been through wars. We've been through many other calamities that we've came out of, and the underlying trend picked up again. And that will be true for a post-COVID situation. From the ecological perspective, whether we agree or not on the level of impact of climate change, whether we agree or not on the pace of that change, something we all agree on is the direction of climate change. And that is, the current situation is not sustainable. We are talking about finite resources when it comes to fossil fuels. It doesn't matter how long in the future they will be available. And the reserves are estimates, but the issue is they are finite. So by definition, we have no choice. We have to currently look towards renewable energy to have a more sustainable, and here we're not talking about decades, we're talking about generations down the line, to have a more sustainable sources of energy. And one thing about the point about energy mix is, this is not a question of mutually exclusive or competing sources. They are not. Every country, and Susie alluded to it earlier, every country has its own specific needs and situation. And I think we just have to optimize that model. We have to optimize that situation with a goal of having the lowest footprint, the lowest carbon footprint. What's true for Senegal is not necessarily true for Zambia. What's true for South Africa is not necessarily true for Egypt. But the one thing that's true for all of them is current situation is not tenable, it's not sustainable. We have to move toward a more renewable mix. And I think, again, nuclear has a role to play when it comes to base load. Oil, actually, if you look at the global energy production for electricity mainly, oil has a very limited role. The biggest one would be coal, natural gas, and renewables, I think, in third. So the real competitor actually for renewable is natural gas, coal to a certain extent, but more and more what you will see is that even from a financial perspective, most financial backers, and I think a question I alluded to it earlier, the largest world, the largest money managers in the world are pulling their money and cash out of coal. Of course, it's not a purely business decision. There is an ideological decision, but believe it or not, business is about ideology. That's how you start trends. That's how you start progress. And I think, the writing is on the wall for everybody to see. Renewable is here to stay, and they will only grow.
If I could piggyback on what Massaer said, and I think are we getting ready to close out? So these are last comments here, Katie and Dr.
So we'll have just a few more minutes after we tackle this subject. Let's move to the local content and the diversity issue, and then we'll close after that.
Okay, that sounds good. Thank you. Yes, I wanted to talk about the issue of locality and moving into, we talked about IP a little bit, but how a question that came up from the audience was Nuria asked about, given the inherent risks of nuclear and the situation in many parts of Africa where there can be political instability, and they alluded to perhaps terrorism or riots that could be happening, why would nuclear fit into that mix? And so I think it's really important to make the point that civil nuclear power plants that are used to generate electricity are vastly different, even the same kind of process as a weapons complex. So those are two completely separate ideas. And in terms of small modular reactors, for example, usually 2/3 of those are underground. So the safety factor is completely different. In the United States, they are working reconfiguring and evolving our regulatory process around advanced nuclear because of different layouts. So for example, with traditional nuclear, there's an emergency planning zone of about 10 miles that goes around each nuclear power. For a small modular reactor, they're looking at a 0 emergency planning zone because most of it is underground. So different scenario. However, still plant security of any electric power plant is paramount. So it's really important to have solid physical security right there at any power plant, whether it's wind, solar, nuclear, wherever you're transitioning from the power generating source to the distributed grid. It's important to have security there. So, but in locality, there's many different kinds of jobs that go into a power plant, and nuclear is no different than that. So with nuclear power, with renewables, with hydro, with coal, gas, you know, there's going to be the need to hire human resources people, business people and finance, management people, physical security, all those marketing, communications, all those different kinds of jobs. And so I think when you look at your partner that you'd be working with, especially if it's an intergovernmental organization, be sure that you keep that in mind. I know with the United States, when we work with other government partners, it's important for us to bring their workforce and offer them to come, and oftentimes they'll go and spend an extended period of time at one of our national science labs, and they learn all about how to operate that facility, and they get the training from some of the best in the world. And so being able to train the local people to operate the technology is an important part of at least what we do in the US and partnering with other countries. So I think it's crucial, and I'm glad that you asked the question, because it's really important that each nation develop their people as they're developing their infrastructure. It's important, and especially I have to give a plug for a gender balanced approach. I'm a vice chair on the Clean Energy Ministerial's C3E, which is the Clean Energy Education and Empowerment Initiative, that really reminds organizations that equal pay and equal opportunity for women are especially important, and a diverse workforce really creates a great outcome. So that's another point I just wanted to be able to make today.
Thank you, Susie. Nelly, over to you in terms of the sort of localization and opportunities for local energy entrepreneurs and women. How do we create a support ecosystem to nurture that these future opportunities in Africa?
No, absolutely. With regard to the issue around local content and also the presence of women in the energy space, I'm of the view that one of the opportunities that we have as entrepreneurs is being agile. We have to be able to make decisions very, very quickly, and we are able to utilize the technology in the most effective way. One of the issues that I mentioned before is that there is a lot of body of work that has been done in research and development of various technologies in the energy space. All I would like to see happening is government supporting entrepreneurs to be able to deploy those energy systems, to make sure then that they are localized, make sure that manufacturing happens locally. And one of the greatest issues about women in energy is the fact that actually we are primary users of energy, and it makes a lot of sense to be the ones who actually drive the energy systems going into the future. And therefore, for us, for me, or rather for us as Africans, I'm of the view that we've gone beyond the idea that energy is a male field. We have seen quite a number of women entrepreneurs in the energy space operating quite successfully. All we need now is just economies of scale and making sure that we've got more women in that space to make sure that we have more and more women who are actually going to do that. And I remember the 3CE when I was still in government. It's a very, very important program. And it's not just only for us women in the energy space, but also it's for the young girls at school, because that's where it starts. Girls must make sure that they opt for STEM as a choice in order for them to be able to proceed and be the future energy managers going into the future. So it's a very, very important program, and South Africa has participated on it quite effectively. But I think it's also a good program just for the continent in general, in order to share certain ideas and skills when it comes to development of women in the energy space.
Thank you, Nelly, and I think you're a fine role model of exactly that, and the chairman of Matleng Energy and developing out in the region, showing leading by example. I think it's inspiration to many, and it requires an entrepreneurial mindset. And I must say, from a technology perspective, and certainly as the Research Council, we, for example, are not wedded to any technology, but we do look with interest at the cost, the economics, and the technical integration challenges of different options, and then, of course, the local socio-economic opportunities. And they are dramatically different in terms of localizing, for example, small-scale PV or wind solutions in a rural African context versus trying to build a new generation for nuclear reactor, and the opportunities, the barriers to entry, and for technology innovation in an African context. And I think there is a very, very real tension in that system that we need technology. But in saying that it doesn't mean that there isn't a role for all the different energy sources based on the specifics. But Massaer, over to you. You mentioned in your bio also that you have a strong tribal focus in terms of the local socio-economic impacts of your projects, or maybe what you and as a company are doing. How are you supporting the sort of local entrepreneurial and economic development through the implementation of your projects?
Sure, that's a very important aspect of this, of this whole topic. A lot of time, the use of a technology, can be a catalyst for really, driving the IP behind the technology. And a lot of time, mostly in Africa, we miss that second step. We don't leverage our uses of technology to drive the IP behind the technology. And at Lekela Power, we are very focused on, and actually it makes a very strong business sense to localize expertise. It's just a pure business, reason to do it, beside the social and social impact aspect of it. But it does make a lot of sense, But one thing that's very important is local content, local IP requires local expertise, and it doesn't matter where you are in the world. That is true. The African context is not different from the American context. It's not different from the Chinese context. Local content, local IP will require everywhere local expertise. And that's where political will and leadership is important, to make sure that companies like ours, when we are investing in South Africa, when we're investing in Senegal, Egypt, Ghana, we have a local base of expertise we can tap on to train if required, but to have the knowledge, at least the basic fundamental knowledge that's available, to be able to use or to train in a very quick manner to manage that those projects. A good example of that is in Senegal. Our wind farm in Senegal is huge. It's 158 megawatts. That represents 15% of the country's power production. Guess what? 100% or 99% of the people working and running that wind farm are local Senegalese. The oldest might be 40, I think. So they are young, mostly locally trained engineers who are very modern in their approach, who have the fundamental skills when it comes to science. And renewable energy has also a very positive thing, is it's very forward-looking. If you take an example of a wind farm, it's mainly data-driven. It's AI. It's modeling data analysis. It's modeling, weather prediction, because you're trying to limit that intermittent nature. You're trying not to fluctuate enough so that you are reliable to the grid. That takes a lot of analysis work, and it's, whether you like it, data engineers working in our wind farm in Senegal. So again, back to that point of using a need to drive the technological IP behind that need and that consumption is important. And I think our local governments and political leadership have a role to play, and actually only them can play that role. It's not the role of a private company to be training kids in high school to have engineering skills. That is the role of the government, and they have to play that role so that when we are ready to invest, we have the local expertise to tap on. On the gender side of the issues, we are very honored actually at the Lekela level, at the group level, to have joined the IFC Gender to Equal initiative. That is an initiative that is really pushing companies like ours, companies in the energy sector, in renewable energy sector, to have the gender aspect ingrained in every aspect of our business, whether it's the hiring, whether it's the training, whether it's the operation. And we are learning a lot through that initiative. And I think, we will definitely try to push that gender equality going forward in our business processes.
Perfect. So with that, we're going to start to wrap up the webinar. This has been a really engaging discussion. Unfortunately, we did not get to all of the audience questions, but thank you so much for all of your participation. This full video will be available on YouTube. We'll send that out to everybody, a link to everybody who registered, as well as a highlight video coming in the next few days. I just want to really quickly mention that we do have several upcoming webinars, including, looking at Kenya's oil and gas sector, closing deals, advancing FID during COVID-19, and navigating risk, looking at some of the increasing threats under this economic environment. So you can find those at www.aopwebinars.com. And now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Carter Brown and our panelists. If each of you just want to maybe provide a 1-minute wrap up, you can summarize your thoughts or maybe get to a question that we weren't able to answer. I'll leave that up to you.
Super, thank you. Maybe start with Massaer and then Susie and Nelly, and then I can conclude. Thank you.
Again, thanks Clinton, and thanks everyone. Thanks AOP and African Energy Chambers for putting it together. Great initiative, and I'm looking forward to joining and calling in and listening to other panels you are going to put together soon. Just maybe a closing remarks from me is, I think renewable energy do present a great opportunity for African countries to really, strike two birds with one stone. And that is providing power to our population. And again, most of our population actually don't have access to power now. So, but doing that in a clean, reliable, and using a technology we can leverage to develop IP, I think is really an opportunity we cannot miss. So I think I'm hoping that our political leaders and at the national and international level will really seize this opportunity, again, especially from a post-COVID situation where there's a lot of investment that will be done to restart these economies so that we don't replicate the same mistakes we've made after the 2008 financial crisis, where most of the investment were really driven by fossil fuel-based, uses. So I think hopefully we will use this opportunity to do that, and it starts well. Just this week, the European Union announced that they will be, putting aside a large portion of their, economic recovery fund to to green solutions and you know, to help the energy transition to a more sustainable future. Thank you all.
Thank you, Susie. Oh, Susie, I think you're muted.
There we go. I want to thank the organizers, and I also want to thank those African organizations that recently signed on to the Equal by 30 initiative under the Clean Energy Ministerial for gender diversity. And Massaer, your organization is one, the African Energy Chamber is another, the African Oil and Energy Group. Thank you all for signing on to that important gender diversity initiative in Equal by 30. The last point I want to make is if your interest is piqued in learning more about nuclear for any reason, visit ifnec.org. This month of June coming up is Small Modular Reactor Month for IFNEC. And every Tuesday, there's going to be a webinar on a small modular reactor SMR topics. So if you're interested in learning more, IFNEC is a great resource. That's ifnec.org. And always the U.S. Department of Energy is very anxious to be helpful in education and outreach on energy sources across the board. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Susie. Nelly?
Okay, sorry, sorry about that. Thanks again to the panelists and also to you, Clinton, and also the organizers for this opportunity. It's always, I always get to learn something new in these webinars. But what I just would like to say as a final point is that it's important that each and every country has a pragmatic approach to energy mix, and we should make sure that we reduce the carbon footprint while ensuring security of energy supply. But also, I just would like to indicate that with the COVID-19, my sense is that there is going to be a kind of a knee-jerk reaction where a lot of investments will be done on the infrastructure. The positive issue in there is that this will require also a deployment of communications infrastructure. That deployment of communications infrastructure will enable collection of data that will provide utilities with information to plan better for the future for any eventuality. I thank you.
Thank you, Nelly. And certainly from my side, a huge thank you to all of the panelists and for Katie and team and at the AOP. Thank you very much for all of the great organizing and for arranging this webinar. Certainly from my side, really learned a lot and thoroughly enjoyed engaging with everyone and the panelists. It'd be great to go through all in detail all of the questions and to engage further. This is a very important debate, and it's one that won't start and stop today. Africa is a massive opportunity. We still have lots of people that don't yet have access to energy. So we must avoid, divisive discussions around a technology of one versus the other. There is so much need in the continent. There is so much potential that we really need to just create that enabling environment for the funding to flow and for the entrepreneurs to create these new opportunities. Very similar to what has happened in the mobile telecommunications space, the new blockchain, the technologies, the business models, transactive Bitcoin type technologies that are going to make retailing and selling energy in Africa pervasive. So a wonderful session, and thank you everyone for your time. I really, really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank
Perfect.
you.
Everybody, thank you so much. This has been such a great webinar, and we'll see you at our next webinar. Have a great day. Bye.
Thank you very much.